Microphone on. Is this picking anything up?
No.
No? If I turn it on, will that work?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And I'm supposed to be recording this for somebody. I hope that's plugged in. You're going to have it, so
Yeah, it's all good.
if it comes to worse, all right. Okay. All right, I'm sorry about that breathtaking last-minute arrival. I kind of like to do that, the drama and so on. The problem behind it was something that I would never accept as an excuse from any of my students, which is that I sat down at the computer to add some things to the notes, and of course the printer then failed. Printers always fail for me when time is short. I discovered early on when I was teaching at BYU that photocopy machines have a tension meter attached to them. If your class is within 5 minutes or something like that, they will shut down. They will jam or whatever it is. They'll just mysteriously cease to function. My printer actually indicated that it was printing, but I have eyes, it wasn't, and nothing was coming out of it. And I'd spent some time adding things onto notes that I wanted to talk about, and I thought, well, I could just bag the notes. No, I can't do that. I have to wait here, anyway. And anyway, it was a disaster. So I left at the last possible moment and arrived at precisely 7 o'clock, so I'm very pleased with myself. But I do have some things prepared that I wanted to talk about. First question would be, I suppose, why am I giving this lecture? The answer is because I was asked to. It may be significant, though, that DNA is an anagram of Dan. Making sole qualification to speak about this. I'm not a geneticist. I don't even play one on TV. And so I'm not really going to discuss the details of Amerindian genetics or anything like that. But as a matter of fact, I don't believe that's what the issue is about in the end. It's not really about genetics, it's not about DNA, it's about how to interpret the Book of Mormon. I'll have more to say about that a little bit later on. I first encountered the DNA argument against the Book of Mormon in a newsletter that's emitted by Ed Decker's Ex-Mormons for Jesus, or Saints Alive in Jesus. Notwithstanding the source, I thought, this issue could become a serious one. Need to pay attention to this. The argument basically was that we are now able to chart the history of migrations and so on and so forth, the deep genetic history of peoples, by analyzing the genetic data in contemporary descendants of those peoples. And that so far studies of American Indian populations had not yielded any evidence of Jewish connections. And so this was, according to Ed Decker, who always deals in hyperbole, a death blow to the Book of Mormon. I mean, it's all over. The Mormons are on life support, and they just don't know it, and the life support's about to be pulled. Well, I don't go to Ed Decker for careful explications of historical issues or anything like that. Nevertheless, it did seem serious to me. It seemed worth looking at, and so I began to try to provoke some interest in colleagues in dealing with what I saw as a looming issue. I see myself as sort of the, remember the old DEW line, the old radar system that was set up to monitor incoming missiles and that sort of thing. Sometimes I see myself that way. I have a fascination with what's going on the web. I like to see what issues are out there, what are troubling some people, what issues are getting certain of our critics excited, so that I'll know what's coming. And sometimes I feel like the canary in the coal mine, or more precisely, I feel like Cassandra. Any of you remember your classical history, classical mythology? Cassandra was the daughter of King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy, who was cursed by Apollo with the gift of prophecy and the promise that she would never be believed. So she would see what was coming and she would warn people, but nobody would ever believe her or take her seriously. And so she foresaw the fall of Troy, her native city, the death of Agamemnon. She warned against the Trojan horse, all to no avail. Nobody had ever paid any attention. It was all in vain. Or I sometimes feel a little bit like Robert Conquest. Here you're going to see me indulging in my maudlin self-pitying side. Robert Conquest is a hero of mine. He's a historian of the Soviet Union and a poet. A very anti-communist historian of the Soviet Union, which you may think seems fairly obvious, but a few decades ago it wasn't. He was considered very far out on the right wing and so on. He wrote a number of books, one called Harvest of Sorrow, which was about the great Ukrainian terror famine, where Stalin essentially built a wall, in effect, around the Ukraine to starve it into submission, to starve it into collectivization, to kill off the upper classes, and the rich kulaks, the farmers, and so on. And Robert Conquest chronicled this, and came up with just an enormous number of deaths. And he was widely regarded as a nutcase because of this. Now, when the Soviet Union fell and the archives were opened, people got into them and began looking around, they found that his figures were very, very accurate. He was right on the mark. And so when the next issue or next edition of his book came out, they asked him for a new foreword, the new edition. And I'm sorry I can't quote it to you here, because it was something along the lines of, it was very short, one sentence. I told you so, you blank, 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 blanks. Because he'd been saying this for years and no one paid any attention. And so, you know, I have to say that I was a little frustrated at the first to get any kind of attention given to this issue. You know, no one was taking it seriously. The same way I felt for a long time. When I wrote a book years ago called Offenders for a Word, in which I tried to take on the issue of people who say that Latter-day Saints are not Christians, even the people who published it said, well, one of them came to me after it appeared and he said, well, but who in the world would ever say that Mormons aren't Christians? I mean, does anybody ever say that, really? Well, you know, welcome to the real world. You know, I've worried about the internet for years, and I'm happy we're now responding. And the Mitt Romney campaign, I think, opened a lot of eyes of Latter-day Saints to the fact that we are not exactly beloved among many segments of American society. Well, I've known that for years because I'm a paranoid. And so, again, I felt like saying, I told you so, and this wasn't a surprise to me. You really expected the Southern Baptists were going to line up in droves to vote for Mitt Romney? I mean, come on. So, enough whining, though. Ed Decker doesn't have a lot of credibility even in anti-Mormon circles, and so he began mentioning the subject. Nobody did anything with it. But eventually it did begin to show up. There was an ex-Mormon, for example, in Washington State who started roiling the waters, talking about how the Book of Mormon was disproven, or at least rendered hugely implausible by the genetic data. And some people began to notice this and began talking about it as what they called a Galileo event. Now, I have to admit that my instincts are immediately enlivened when I notice hype like that. I just love when I see an overinflated balloon to prick it. And so the idea that this was a Galileo event caught my attention. It was, among other things, a misreading of not only the Book of Mormon, the present situation of genetic research, as far as I could tell, but also Galileo's story. I mean, I grew up, and probably a lot of you did, with the notion of this never-ending warfare between science and religion. It's an artifact of a certain era of scholarship, which is now largely discredited. Not many people know that. I mean, you had famous books like, in 1874, John William Draper wrote a book called A History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. Or an even more famous book in 1896, still in print, I think, and I've seen it in paperback editions, by Andrew Dixon White, called History of the Warfare of Science with Theology and Christendom. And these books took a really simplistic view of things, that you had science, the ever, forward-marching scientific method and so on, and against it was the church, usually the Catholic Church, but not always the Catholic Church, just religion. It was a nice, satisfying drama of guys in white hats, the scientists, and guys in black hats, the cardinals, the popes, the clergy, and so on, who always and everywhere opposed scientific progress. It turns out to be largely nonsense, and more recent historians of science will argue with great sophistication that in fact much of science grows right out of the Christian tradition. Copernicus was a canon of the church in Prague. A lot of these people, the great scientists of the early days, were theologians as well as scientists. And many of them said, look, we're doing this, Newton, for example, I am decoding the hand of God in nature, the language of God in nature, and the language of God is mathematics. Kepler was motivated by religious concerns in his work. You have Galileo himself talking about reading about God in two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And this idea that there was an opposition of science and religion, and that the church was always opposed to scientific progress, using the church broadly, is simply not true. even in the story of Galileo himself, it's pretty clear that there were cardinals who favored Galileo, and there were cardinals who opposed him. And the people who really hated him were not the cardinals or the church leaders, they were